Hello there! Today, we will be talking about the evolution of the influenza virus. To begin, I'll tell you a little bit about its background. The influenza virus, more commonly known as the flu, has existed for over 1500 years. In today's age, the flu feels pretty similar to a cold, and with the technology that we have today, the flu doesn't really pose a huge threat to our world. However, this is not always the case. In this video, we will show the evolution of the influenza virus starting from the 1918 flu pandemic that devastated the world to its constant mutations that caused other smaller outbreaks to emerge. There are 4 major types of influenza: A, B, C, and D. And within each type of virus, there are subtypes that further differentiate the strains. Let's begin by describing the structure of the influenza virus and the differences between the various subtypes. The influenza virus is generally spherical in shape with an outer lipid membrane, or envelope, which is derived from the host cell that it infects. The envelope is covered with these spike-like structures called glycoproteins, whose purpose is to ensure viral binding to the host cell. There are 2 major glycoproteins that are found in influenza A: hemagglutinin, or HA, and neuraminidase, or NA. The type of glycoprotein present on the envelope is what allows scientists to differentiate between the different subtypes of influenza A. Right underneath the envelope, there's a rigid protein structure called a capsid, which is where the viral genetic information is stored and protected. But what is the difference between the different subtypes? It all depends on who the virus infects. While influenza A and B are the strains responsible for infecting humans, the type C virus typically infects pigs, and the type D primarily infects cattle. While type C can infect humans, it doesn't prove nearly as devastating as types A and B. It is also important to note that the influenza A is the only type responsible for all the major flu pandemics, and the reason it is so deadly is attributed to its fast mutation rate. Now that we know the major differences between the strains, we'll do a brief overview of the history of the influenza viruses and how it has evolved over time. It wasn't until the year 1918 that influenza was first recorded, but by then, it became a serious problem. The 1918 pandemic was by far the deadliest spread of a virus in recent history. It infected 500 million people, which was 1/3 of the world's population at the time, and it killed an estimated 50 million. As we know today, the virus mainly spreads via droplets of sick people through sneezing and coughing, so the close contact and continuous movement of all the soldiers during World War I allowed for the virus to wreak havoc on the world. The specific strain responsible for this massacre is known as the H1N1 strain, which is a subtype of influenza A. Nobody knows how the H1N1 virus that started the pandemic originated, but it certainly left its mark on the world. After the 1918 pandemic terrorized the world, scientists were determined to find the cause of the pathogen responsible for the annihilation. Originally, researchers believed that the influenza was caused by bacteria after a scientist named Dr. Richard Pfeiffer isolated an unknown sample of bacteria from the sputum of his sick flu patients in the late 1800s. However, after a group of scientists isolated the bacterium from the lungs of infected pigs and injected it into healthy pigs with no major side effects, they realized that the flu was not caused by bacteria like they had thought. It took several years, but eventually in the 1930s, researchers were able to isolate the virus responsible for the flu-like symptoms from humans for the first time, which put an end to the enigmatic origins of the influenza virus. The influenza virus is unique in its structure, with a genome consisting of 8 segments of single-stranded ribonucleic acid, or RNA for short. This is the genetic information that influenza uses to replicate, which is similar to our DNA. The segmented genome leads to a much higher degree of genetic reassortment, which can lead to new influenza strains that cause pandemics such as the Spanish flu. Influenza spreads primarily through droplets in the air, which allows the virus to attach to cells within the nasal passages and throat. The hemagglutinin surface proteins on the virus, which acts as little keys, then bind to receptors on the surface of human cells and unlock access to our cells. This allows the virus to make millions of copies of itself, marking the beginning of a flu infection. Then, in the 1940s, around 10 years after the virus's discovery, the first influenza vaccine trials began. Researchers at the University of Michigan were able to further research the influenza virus and eventually develop the first inactive vaccine for influenza virus using chicken eggs. Around this time, another strain of the flu known as influenza B virus was also discovered. The major difference between the 2 subtypes is that influenza A can infect both humans and animals, whereas the influenza B virus only infects humans. Plus, influenza A mutates at a much faster rate. In 1957, yet another strain of influenza emerged in East Asia and took the world by storm. This strain was named H2N2, but was more commonly known as the Asian flu. This H2N2 strain evolved from both the Spanish flu and an avian strain of influenza A. The virus spread across the world, and by the pandemic's end in 1958, an estimated 1.1 million had died from this strain. The only reason why the strain did not wreak as much havoc as the 1918 pandemic flu did is because microbiologist Dr. Maurice Hillman and his colleagues noticed that another pandemic was about to emerge before it was too late. Working quickly, they found that the majority of people lacked antibody protection from the new strain, but a small group of elderly people who survived a previous pandemic showed an antibody response to the new virus. Using this vital information, they were able to produce an effective vaccine to prevent the H2N2 strain in only 4 months, which was then distributed nationwide and halted the virus's spread. Unfortunately, just as things were starting to look good and people were recovering from the Asian flu, once again another strain of the influenza virus emerged to terrorize the world. This strain was known as H3N2 and it evolved from the H2N2 strain with the help of gene reassortment. Gene reassortment is the mixing of viral gene segments from 2 different influenza strains within a single host cell. These viruses combine to form a new strain of influenza, giving influenza the ability to reinvent itself endlessly. This new strain of virus triggered yet another pandemic in 1968, this time originating in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong flu caused 1 million deaths across the world, but it's likely many more would have died if it weren't for the way the H3N2 strain evolved. Since the strains from the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu were so similar, individuals who were immune to the H2N2 strain also had a basic level of immunity to the H3N2 strain as well, which drastically reduced the death rate. The next evolution of influenza was a new strain of H1N1 known as the swine flu. The virus originated from pigs in Mexico around March of 2009, where it continued to spread to the US and eventually to the rest of the world until it was officially declared a pandemic by June. Despite the swine flu being of the common H1N1 virus, the new strain was very different from anything ever seen before. It appeared that the older someone was, the more likely that they were to have immunity, meaning that young children were at an especially high risk. Because it was so different from the normal H1N1 strain, the vaccines that were made at that time did not provide immunity to others as it usually does. In just the first year of the virus's spread, there were over 60 million cases and an estimated 150,000 to 575,000 deaths. The pandemic officially ended in August of 2010, but this specific strain continues to circulate as a seasonal flu virus. Although the flu devastated the world, eventually the virus started to affect fewer and fewer people through continued vaccine developments. The vaccine that is administered today is most commonly known as the flu shot, and it protects against 4 of the major influenza viruses that rapidly spread during flu season. In order to develop a vaccine, first the WHO identifies which strain of influenza are most likely to spread during flu season. Then fragments of the viruses are extracted and incorporated into the new vaccine, which is usually administered through an injection. The vaccine triggers the immune system to respond by creating antibodies that prepare to fight the virus if it encounters one of the selected strains. These antibodies target the virus's surface antigens, hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, which are the parts of the virus that induce an immune response. Because each strain of influenza has a unique combination of antigens on its surfaces, new vaccines are required each year to keep up with the new strains circulating. There is a common misconception that vaccines do not provide significant protection against the flu virus, but significant evidence shows the contrary. In one article published in 2021, researchers compiled data regarding influenza positivity rates in individuals who received the vaccine and those who did not from the years 2012 to 2018. The results show that the vaccine was consistently efficient in reducing the likelihood of testing positive for the flu, and there was always a higher percentage of flu positivity reported for those who were unvaccinated. This research is significant because it shows the effectiveness of flu vaccines in preventing the spread of the different strains of influenza, so it is important that you get vaccinated to protect yourself from the serious complications that may arise from the flu. In addition to the flu vaccine, there are many other ways to stay healthy and protect yourself from the flu. One of the best ways to stop influenza spread is by avoiding contact with those who are sick and staying home when you show signs of infection. Covering your mouth and nose, washing your hands often, and disinfecting your surroundings are also great ways to stay healthy. Maintaining these habits helps protect both you and your loved ones from getting the flu, so remember to always take these precautions and stay healthy.